Today I'm at Blacktoft Sands, RSPB Nature Reserve. I think sometimes with these hides you can actually be better sitting on the end, but I don't know it too well here, so I'm just going to go for one of the middle windows. The Marsh Harrier is one of our raptors here in the UK, quite a big bird of prey, and they love wetland sites like this where you can see them flying low over the reeds with their heads down scanning for prey. And they have quite a distinctive flight as well, just a few flaps and then often holding their wings in a shallow V. Just in front of the hide we've got quite a few geese, mostly grey lag. I've also got some widgeon, a few mallards out there and a couple of gadwall. And it doesn't take too long before my first sighting of Marsh Harrier. There are quite a few Marsh Harriers here. You're almost guaranteed to see them, but getting good pictures is another thing. I spotted this bird in flight and at first I wasn't actually too sure what it was. It seemed relatively small for a Marsh Harrier, but it was in fact a male Marsh Harrier. And I realised it was actually doing some of its display flight, and it was fantastic to watch. I got some lovely footage, a bit too far away for pictures, but just to watch that Marsh Harrier doing that display flight, climbing up and tumbling down, folding those wings in and diving down was just an absolute joy. And then the female joined as well, and everyone in the hide, we all got to watch the male and the female displaying together in flight. Absolutely fantastic. When I got into the hide, I realised that I'd forgotten my beanbag, which is my intended camera support for today. Now, there are different ways you can support your camera in here. I think it's always difficult in a hide. Now, you could use the beanbag on the window ledge, or you could just use the window ledge itself to rest the lens of your camera. I think what you need to do is you kind of need to pick a point on your lens where you're going to rest it. Another option I tried was actually to use the lens foot, and I found I could just kind of wedge that in a little bit on the window ledge, and that worked quite well. I was able to pan and pivot with that. Another option as well sometimes is to use your camera bag. That can work quite well if you're caught short. You know, you can just put that on top of the shelf and you can just simply rest your camera on top of that. I find it's really difficult to use tripods in here. It's not really set up for that. I think the best option is probably some kind of hide clamp, which I don't actually have. The light today is actually quite nice. I'd call it cloudy bright. So the light levels are fairly high, but it's certainly not harsh. A bit of cloud around that's just giving a softer quality of light. And also that means that you don't get too many harsh shadows as well. I'd say most of the time for your birds in flight, you want a shutter speed of at least 1,000th of a second, maybe between 1,000th and 2,000th. Now the light levels are actually quite good today, so I'm up at 2,000th of a second at the moment. Just closing the aperture down a little bit because I've got less depth of field with this focal length. And the ISO, I'm doing it in two ways today. Sometimes I'm just doing it fully manually, and then at times the sun's kind of coming and going a little bit. So when it's doing that, I'm using auto ISO, and the exposure mode is manual. I'm also overexposing deliberately by about +2/3, and that's because most of the time I'm kind of shooting towards the lighter reeds and some of the water as well, and sometimes a bit of sky. So generally I always need a bit of overexposure to stop the picture coming out too dark. It seems almost everywhere I go, I end up photographing geese. And I don't want to take any standard shots of geese today. But when you've got some really interesting behaviour and some action happening in front of the hide, then it's definitely worth photographing. This is a great place for Marsh Harrier, and they seem to be doing really well here and in the surrounding area. But in terms of photography, it is quite difficult. Most of the time, those Marsh Harriers are going to be pretty distant. They're probably going to be on the other side of the water. So I made the right choice, I think, adding the 1.4 extender, which gives me a total focal length of 700mm on the full frame R6. And even with that amount of reach, which is quite a lot really, they were still almost always pretty small in the frame. So I really just concentrated on trying to take more environmental shots, both horizontal and vertical, just trying to get more of that habitat and particularly the reeds underneath. Occasionally a Marsh Harrier did come a little bit closer. I had a couple of issues where the camera just refused to focus at the most important moment, which sometimes happen. Really, really frustrating. It is pretty difficult here to get close-up views of the Marsh Harriers, but it did remind me of an experience I had over in Serbia. This is where I go every year, do a trip to take 4 clients, and in one of the water hides I was just taken by surprise one morning when a female Marsh Harrier came floating over the reeds and just came so close, and she was briefly hovering over the reed beds, literally right in front of us. And another memorable encounter was actually when a male Marsh Harrier attempted to attack some mallard ducklings, and the parent duck actually leapt up from the water and tried to chase it off. I have absolutely loved watching these Marsh Harriers today, just watching them float so gracefully over the reeds. Absolutely fantastic bird. Now, if I came back, which I certainly like to, I think what I'd do is I would just head for one of the side windows. I'd just put myself there. And the reason for that is that the Marsh Harriers tend to fly more over the reeds. That's usually where they're hunting more rather than the open water. And the reeds do extend a little bit kind of on either side of the hide. So if you get a Marsh Harrier flying over there, then it's always going to be a bit closer. Yes, it might take longer, you might have less opportunities to get any pictures, but if you do get opportunities, then the bird is going to be a bit closer. Definitely challenging today, largely just because of the birds just were never really close enough. They were always quite distant, even with the big lens and the extender and that amount of focal length. So if you come here, I'd say the more focal length you've got, the better. Now, if you like this style of video, me photographing from hides, then click the video up on the screen, which is me photographing jays in flight from a hide near Leeds. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.